There is something Gandalf brought back from the dungeons of Sauron's fortress that he never told Galadriel. Not because he didn't trust her, not because he doubted her strength or her wisdom or her perception, which was arguably greater than his own. He kept it from her because he understood something about knowledge that the rest of the White Council never fully grasped. Some things, once spoken aloud, cannot be contained. Some truths, delivered to the wrong mind at the wrong moment, do not illuminate. They ignite, and what Gandalf carried out of Dol Guldur was exactly that kind of truth. This isn't conjecture pulled from shadow. Tolkien wrote it down, buried in unfinished tales, and layered across the appendices and the letters. A pattern of deliberate concealment that begins in the dungeons of Sauron's stronghold and runs quietly, like a crack through stone, beneath every major event of the Third Age. The map, the key, the dying dwarf who had once held one of the seven, the things Thrain said in his final hours, in a place where Sauron's thought pressed against every mind like a cold hand. Gandalf took all of it, and said almost nothing. So here is the question this entire story orbits. Did Gandalf stay silent about what he took from Dol Guldur because he believed Galadriel was strong enough to bear the knowledge, or because he knew she was, and feared what she would do with it? Start with what Tolkien actually recorded. In Unfinished Tales, in the section called The Quest of Erebor, Tolkien gives us something unusual. Gandalf speaking in his own voice, explaining his own reasoning, offering a retrospective account of how the events leading to the Quest of Erebor came together. This is not the compressed summary of the appendices or the elusive references scattered through the main text. This is Gandalf, at the end of the War of the Ring, explaining to Frodo and the others what he was actually doing and why. And in that account, he describes going to Dol Guldur alone, not with the White Council, not with Galadriel beside him, alone. He says he had already suspected for some years that the necromancer was not some lesser spirit, but Sauron himself, returned in diminished but growing form. And so he went to look. He went into that fortress, dark and poisoned, and he found what he was looking for. He confirmed it. The necromancer was Sauron. But that is not all he found. In the dungeons of Dol Guldur, in conditions that Tolkien does not describe in comfortable detail, Gandalf found Thrawn, the son of Thror, the rightful king under the mountain, who had set out years before with a small company to begin reclaiming his people's fortune and had never returned. Had never returned because he had walked into the shadow of Dol Guldur and stayed there, imprisoned, for years, his mind half broken, his body failing. And the last of the 7 dwarf rings still in Sauron's possession now, taken in that very dungeon. Think about what Thrain was when Gandalf found him. He was a dwarf who had carried one of the 7. One of the rings Sauron himself had forged in the likeness of the One, imbued with its shadow, designed to draw their bearers toward him. The 7 had affected the dwarves differently than Sauron intended, their nature too solid and resistant for full enslavement, but they were not unchanged. The rings fueled their lust for gold, magnified their hoarding instinct, drove them toward obsession and ruin. Thrain's father Thror had wandered alone back into Moria and died there, perhaps half-maddened. Thrain had watched his people's fortunes erode and spent years trying to rebuild what was lost. And then he had walked, perhaps drawn by the ring itself, into Dol Guldur. Sauron took the ring from him there. And here is the part that almost nobody talks about. Thrain had been inside Sauron's fortress for years. Years of exposure to whatever it is that Sauron is, when he chooses to press his will against a captive mind. Thrain had felt that searching presence in the intimate and inescapable way that only prisoners know. He had survived it. Barely, and at tremendous cost, but he had survived. Which means that whatever Sauron was thinking about, whatever Sauron was seeking, whatever Sauron's attention was fixed on during those years of Thrawn's captivity, Thrawn had been inside that searchlight. Gandalf found him dying, half coherent. He could not give Gandalf his name, but he gave him the map. And the key. Now hold the map and the key in your mind for a moment. These are not small things. The map of the lonely mountain, the key to the secret door, The objects that would, as Gandalf would later arrange, become the spine of Thorin Oakenshield's quest, the mechanism by which Smaug the dragon would eventually be driven from Erebor and the north made safer. Without these objects there is no quest. Without the quest, Smaug sits on the lonely mountain for another century, perhaps longer. And without the dragon removed from that strategic position, Sauron's return would have found a ready weapon in the north. Gandalf understood all of this. He explains it himself in The Quest of Erebor. He says he was thinking about the dragon problem long before Thorin came to the Green Dragon Inn in Bree. He says he had already identified Smaug as a threat that would need to be resolved before the war with Sauron reached its crisis point. He was thinking decades ahead. But here is what he did not say. Here is what the White Council was never told. He said nothing about the map, nothing about the key, nothing about Thrawn, or what Thrawn had been through, or what might be extracted from the experience of a mind that had spent years under Sauron's pressing thought in the dungeons of Dol Guldur. The White Council knew that Gandalf had gone to Dol Guldur. Galadriel knew. She had arguably encouraged it, the lore in Unfinished Tales showing her as one of the most proactive members of the Council on the question of the necromancer, the one most urgently pushing for investigation and action. She was right to push. She understood the danger. And yet when Gandalf came back from that fortress with something in his pocket and knowledge in his head, he shared the minimum. He told them the necromancer was Sauron. This they acted on. Eventually. The White Council drove Sauron from Dol Guldur in 2941 of the Third Age, though Sauron had anticipated this and withdrawn on his own terms. But the rest of it, Gandalf kept. Why? It is tempting to assign this to caution, to the general habit of the wise, who do not speak unnecessarily. But Gandalf was not simply being careful. He was making a specific calculation. And to understand that calculation, you have to understand what Galadriel was, and what she carried. Galadriel bore Nenya, the ring of water, the ring of adamant, one of the three that Celebrimbor had forged in secret, without Sauron's touch, without Sauron's knowledge. The great act of independent creation that gave the elves their last defense against the shadow. Tolkien is explicit in Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age in the Silmarillion. The three were made by Celebrimbor alone, after he realized the deceiver who had taught him ringcraft was Sauron, after he understood what the One Ring meant, and how all the other rings were bound to it. The three were never touched by Sauron in their forging. They were clean of him in a way no other rings of power ever were. And this, paradoxically, was exactly what made their bearers so vulnerable. Because Sauron knew the three existed. He had felt them, briefly, when he put on the one in the forges of Mordor and reached out through it. Tolkien records this in Unfinished Tales, in the history of Galadriel and Celeborn. The bearers of the three felt him reaching, and they took the rings off and hid them, and so Sauron never learned which elves had them, or where the rings were. This was the great secret the elves held, and it held for the entire Third Age. Sauron spent 3,000 years, not knowing who bore the three. Picture this, a dark lord who can see almost everything, whose thought reaches across thousands of miles of land and water, who has built an entire intelligence apparatus through the Nine and through lesser servants and spies, sitting with this one blind spot. 3 rings, 3 bearers, somewhere in Middle-earth. And the ring's power is being used, quietly, carefully, to preserve what Sauron most wants to destroy. He could feel the effects. He could sense that something was working against the tide of decay and shadow he was pushing outward, but he could not locate the source, not precisely. And Galadriel, who bore one of the three, and used its power to preserve Lothlorien in the amber of its perfection, would have been at the top of his list if he had ever managed to narrow it down. Now go back to Dol Guldur. Go back to Thrain, dying in the dungeon, who had spent years inside Sauron's fortress, after Sauron had completed his collection of the 7. 6 dwarf rings, recovered, and then the 7th, taken from Thrain. 7, accounted for. What comes next, for a mind like Sauron's, after the 7 are complete? The 9 were already bound. Those bearers were fully his. What remained outstanding? What was he still missing from the ledger of rings he had made or influenced? The three. Here is where the canon ends, and the lore's deeper logic begins. Tolkien does not tell us what Sauron said or thought in Thrain's presence. He does not tell us what, if anything, Thrain witnessed or absorbed during his captivity. He tells us Thrain's mind was broken. He tells us Thrain could not give Gandalf his own name when they finally met. He tells us Thrain's grip on identity and coherent thought was essentially gone. But broken is not empty. The history of Middle-earth and the unfinished tales both show us a Tolkien deeply interested in the way Sauron's presence affected the minds near him. Not through clean destruction, but through something more insidious. A kind of intrusion, a pressure that did not erase thought so much as reshape it, redirect it, saturate it with Sauron's own obsessions. The Nazgul were the most complete expression of this, but they were not the only one. The rings worked this way. The Palantiri, when Sauron held the dominant stone, worked this way. Even Gollum, who had carried the One Ring for 5 centuries, ended up circling obsessively around a single lost object, which was also Sauron's obsession. What if Thrain, in those years of captivity, had been similarly saturated? What if the thing that broke his mind was not just the withdrawal of the ring or the darkness of the dungeon, but exposure to Sauron's searching thought? The same thought that was scanning the world for the three, reaching outward from Dol Guldur in every direction, feeling for those 3 specific signatures of power that had slipped away from him in the Second Age. If this is true, and Tolkien's cosmological rules give it a firm foundation even if it is not stated outright, then Thrain in his last hours might have been carrying something. Not knowledge exactly, not a message Sauron intended him to deliver, but an imprint. An echo of the thing Sauron was looking for, something in the texture of his broken speech and broken memory that a sufficiently perceptive mind could read, the way you might read the shape of a key from the impression it leaves in wax. Gandalf was that mind, and here is where this becomes almost unbearable to sit with. Gandalf did not just take a map and a key out of Dol Guldur. He might have taken the understanding that Sauron, having now recovered all 7 of the dwarf rings, had turned the full weight of his attention toward what remained. The 3, the hidden rings, the rings whose bearers he could not name but could feel, somewhere in the world, working against him. And one of those bearers was Galadriel. Let us talk about the White Council for a moment, because this is the context that makes Gandalf's silence so calculated. The White Council was established in the Third Age as a gathering of the most powerful and wise beings remaining in Middle-earth. Elves primarily, with the 2 Istari who had risen to prominence by that point, Gandalf and Saruman. Galadriel was a founding force. She had wanted Gandalf to lead it. Tolkien tells us this directly in Unfinished Tales. Galadriel wished Gandalf to take the leadership of the White Council, and when Saruman was preferred over him, more overtly impressive, more authoritative, more willing to dominate a room, she accepted the outcome, but her preference had been clearly stated. She trusted Gandalf above Saruman. She saw something in Gandalf that Saruman either did not have or had suppressed. And Gandalf, trusted above all others by the being who bore Nenya, came back from Dol Guldur and told the council the necromancer was Sauron, and told them nothing else. Saruman had his own reasons for withholding information from the council. He had been searching for the One Ring himself in secret, and feared that drawing attention to Sauron's specific searches might put others on the trail of what he was privately chasing. Tolkien shows us a White Council that was, in the end, a gathering of the wise who were each, in their own way, holding something back. But Saruman's silence was self-serving. His concealment served his own ambition. Gandalf's was something else. Pay attention to this next part, because this is where it gets strange. Gandalf, in Letter 107, is described by Tolkien as a servant of the secret fire, sent to Middle-earth specifically, to operate through encouragement and inspiration, and the kindling of courage in others. Not through direct power, not through the open wielding of his Maya nature, not through the kind of dominating omniscience that Saruman moved toward. His mandate was humility. Strategic, deliberate, deeply considered humility. He was not supposed to solve Middle-earth's problems by knowing everything and directing everyone accordingly. He was supposed to inspire others to find their own solutions, their own courage, their own paths. This is not weakness. This is a form of wisdom that Saruman never understood, and that even Galadriel sometimes strained against. And it means that when Gandalf chose silence, it was never casual. It was always the result of a calculation that went something like this. If I say this, what happens next? And is what happens next better or worse than if I say nothing? With Galadriel, in the years following Dol Guldur, the calculation would have been agonizing. Here is what Gandalf would have known, if he had extracted from the experience in Dol Guldur the understanding that Sauron was now hunting the three. He would have known that Galadriel, who bore Nenya, was one of 3 living targets. He would have known that Círdan, who bore Narya before passing it to Gandalf himself, was another. He would have known that Elrond, who bore Vilya, was the 3rd. He would have known that if he told Galadriel this, she would understand immediately the scope of the threat. She was not naive. She was perhaps the most politically sophisticated mind in Middle-earth at that point, with the possible exception of Sauron himself. Having survived the entire First Age, the drowning of Beleriand, the Second Age's long corruption, the fall of Númenor, the War of the Last Alliance. She had seen more history than almost anyone still living. She would understand exactly what it meant if Sauron was now specifically hunting the three, and she might act. Picture this. Galadriel receives Gandalf's news. The three are being hunted. Sauron's attention is turning toward them. She knows what this means. If Sauron finds a single one of the three and takes it, he has leverage over the others. He does not need to destroy them. He does not need to enslave their bearers the way the 9 enslaved men. He needs only to capture one, to threaten its destruction, or use the One Ring to override its function, and the others would be revealed. The bearers would have to act, would have to reveal themselves, would have to choose between the ring's power and their own safety. What does Galadriel do with this knowledge? She might go to the other bearers immediately. She might summon Elrond and Círdan to council and force an open discussion of what they have been protecting, where the rings are, what their plan is if Sauron comes for them specifically. This council would be necessary. It would also be catastrophic if any agent of Sauron learned it was happening. A gathering of the 3 bearers of the three would be a beacon. Sauron could not directly perceive the three, but he could perceive their bearers as individuals, could track their movements through his agents and spies, could draw conclusions from the fact that 3 of the most powerful elves in Middle-earth were suddenly meeting in secret. Or she might act alone. Galadriel acting alone with the knowledge that Sauron was hunting Nenya specifically. This is the scenario that would have kept Gandalf awake. Not because she was untrustworthy, but because she was exactly as powerful as she was. The scale of what she might attempt, the risks she might be willing to take, would be proportional to the scale of her understanding of the threat. She had refused the One Ring itself in the Fellowship of the Ring. She knew her own capacity for a certain kind of decisive, transformative action. If she believed Lothlorien and Nenya were primary targets, she might do something that changed the entire shape of the war before anyone else was ready. And Gandalf was not ready. Not in the years following Dol Guldur. Not in the decades of the Watchful Peace and its unraveling. The strategy for confronting Sauron's return was still forming. Thorin's quest was still a plan in Gandalf's mind, not yet an event. The hobbit who would carry the ring to the crack of doom had not yet been identified, had not yet been prepared, was at that point a comfortable bourgeois creature in a hole in the ground in the Shire. Sauron was moving, but not yet, not quickly enough that the alarm needed to be sounded in a way that might cause a premature confrontation. So Gandalf was silent. There is another dimension to this that requires a step back from the tactical and into the philosophical. Galadriel was not just a political actor, she was a seer. She bore Nenya, and through it she sustained the mirror, the still pool in Lothlorien that showed things that were, things that are, and some things that had not yet come to pass. She was one of the most perceptive minds alive in Middle-earth, not just intelligent, but capable of a kind of perception that ordinary knowledge could not replicate. Tolkien makes this clear in the appendices and in The History of Galadriel and Celeborn. She was one of the last of the Noldor who had seen the light of the two trees. She carried in her memory the direct experience of Aman before the darkening, the full span of what Middle-earth had once been, and what it had been moving towards since. Her grief was not small. Her comprehension was not ordinary. Now think about what it means to give knowledge to someone with perception like that. When you tell Galadriel something, you are not merely informing her. You are giving her a thread that her mind will immediately begin to pull, following it backward through everything she knows, forward into everything she can see, sideways into implications that might not occur to a lesser mind for years. She does not receive information passively. She metabolizes it. She transforms it into strategy and foresight, and sometimes into action that moves before anyone else understands what is happening. Tolkien shows us this in her refusal of the One Ring. The moment Frodo offers her the ring, she does not hesitate and then decide. She had already decided. She says, explicitly, that she had thought about this, that the temptation had been with her for a long time. The possibility of the ring coming to her had already been processed, already been gamed out in all its implications, already been met with a decision made in solitude and held against every passing temptation for years. Think about that. Not tempted and resistant, tempted, for an age. And she still said no. This is the kind of intellect that Gandalf was working around. If he gave her the thread, the understanding that Sauron was now hunting the three specifically, she would begin pulling it immediately. And some of where that thread led would be toward conclusions that were dangerous, not because they were wrong, but because they were right. And acting on them required a readiness that the age had not yet reached. And here is why that matters beyond the tactical. Tolkien understood something about wisdom that he embedded in the structure of his world almost invisibly. The wise are not wise simply because they know more. They are wise because they understand the difference between knowledge that liberates and knowledge that destroys, and they bear the burden of that distinction alone. Nobody asks to carry this burden. It is simply the weight of seeing clearly in a world that mostly cannot. Gandalf carried this burden more than any other figure in the Third Age, not because he was greater than Galadriel in raw power or perception, but because his specific mission was built around it. He was sent to Middle-earth in the form of an old man, capable of weariness and doubt, specifically so that he would feel the weight of knowing what he could not yet say. Here is something that the compressed timeline of the films makes almost impossible to feel. The gap between Gandalf's visit to Dol Guldur, where he found Thrain and confirmed the necromancer, and the actual events of the War of the Ring spans roughly 60 years. 60 years during which Gandalf carried whatever he had taken from that dungeon, the map, the key, the knowledge, the implications, and the world continued to turn. During those 60 years, he and Galadriel continued to work together. The White Council continued to meet. The threat of Sauron continued to grow. Galadriel continued to press, in the council, for action against Dol Guldur. She was right about the urgency. She was always right about the urgency. And Gandalf said nothing, not because he had forgotten, not because the information had become irrelevant, but because the decision made in the years immediately after Dol Guldur, the decision to carry this alone, not to give Galadriel the thread that her mind would inevitably pull to dangerous conclusions, had held across those decades. The longer it held, the harder it became to revisit. The silence became part of the strategy, became part of the foundation on which everything else was being built. Picture this: two figures in the golden halls of Lothlorien. One, an aged wandering wizard in grey, leaning on his staff, whose eyes are tired in a way that does not come from lack of sleep. The other, an immortal elven queen, in robes of white and silver, standing in light that seems to come from within her, her perception open and vast and searching. They speak about Sauron, about the Council's plans, about the movements of shadow in the east. And one of them knows something the other does not. She would feel it, perhaps. Not the specific knowledge, but the shape of it, the presence of something unsaid. Galadriel was not someone you could easily deceive. She was not deceived. She simply could not reach through another person's silence without their consent, and Gandalf's silence was absolute and deliberate, and she would have recognized it as such. This is the intimacy of the burden. She knew he was holding something. He knew she knew, and neither of them named it, because naming it would require either revealing the truth or directly refusing to, and either action would change something fundamental in the relationship between the two beings who were, in that age, perhaps the closest thing to a genuine strategic partnership that Middle-earth possessed. Here is the thing that makes this entire story stranger than it already is. Galadriel did not need Gandalf to tell her. Not entirely, not specifically, but in a broader sense, she already understood the shape of the threat, even if she did not have the particular signal that Gandalf had extracted from Dol Guldur. She bore Nenya. She used it carefully, deliberately, with the constant awareness that its power was the inverse of Sauron's, and that using it at all was a form of declaration, a commitment to the side of preservation and memory against the tide of corruption and ending. She had felt Sauron put on the One Ring in the Second Age. She remembered that moment, that reaching sensation of a vast will touching the edges of what the three were doing. She had taken Nenya off immediately, hidden it, vanished it from that searching thought. She had been hiding it ever since. And she knew, as any mind of her caliber would know, that Sauron's recovery and return brought the question of the three back to the front of every calculation. She did not need a specific report from Dol Guldur to understand that her own existence, and Elrond's, and Círdan's, were precisely the kind of strategic vulnerability that Sauron would identify and target. But knowing the general shape of a threat and knowing its specific current magnitude are different things. What Gandalf might have taken from Thrain's dying hours was the second. Not the principle, but the timeline. Not the possibility, but the imminence. Not Sauron will eventually come for the three, but Sauron has now completed his recovery of the seven, and his full attention is turning toward what remains. That is the difference between vigilance and crisis. And Gandalf, by keeping silent about the specific signal from Dol Guldur, kept Galadriel in the space of vigilance rather than pushing her into crisis. He kept her operating at a level of strategic readiness that was sustainable across decades, rather than triggering an acute response that might have been correct in its assessment but premature in its timing. Whether this was wisdom or a kind of gentle manipulation, even a protective one, is a question that does not resolve itself cleanly. There is one more layer here that tends to be overlooked entirely. Gandalf himself bore a ring of power, not during his time in Dol Guldur, but not much later. Círdan the shipwright gave Gandalf Narya, the Ring of Fire, when Gandalf first arrived in Middle-earth from the west, at the Grey Havens. Tolkien records this in Of the Rings of Power in the Silmarillion. Círdan perceived something in Gandalf that made him understand this Maya would need every resource available, and the ring Círdan had borne since the Second Age was offered freely. So by the time Gandalf went to Dol Guldur and found Thrawn, he was not merely an Istari on a mission. He was a bearer of one of the three. Now think about the implication. If Sauron was hunting the three, and if Gandalf understood from the evidence of Dol Guldur that this hunt was active and accelerating, then Gandalf was not just carrying information about a threat to Galadriel. He was one of three targets. He himself was what he was protecting her from knowing about. There is something almost impossible to sit with in this. The wizard who showed up at Bilbo's door one morning, who looked like a wandering old man, who was capable of being tired and irritable and uncertain and wrong. This figure was also one of the three remaining bearers of the Free People's last defense against Sauron, walking through Middle-earth in disguise, never announcing his ring, never using it openly in ways that might be perceived by Sauron's searching eye. The secrecy around Narya may be part of why Gandalf's silence about Dol Guldur was so complete. If he told Galadriel what he had understood about Sauron's hunt for the three, he would have to explain why it was urgent, and explaining why it was urgent would require accounting for the full scope of what was at stake, which would require acknowledging that Narya existed and that he bore it. which was a piece of information that had been held close for the entirety of the Third Age, precisely because it could not be allowed to reach Sauron. So the silence protected multiple things at once. It protected Galadriel from knowledge that might drive her to premature action. It protected the timing of Gandalf's larger strategy. And it protected Narya, and through Narya, the final secret of the three. Not just who bore them, but that all three bearers were now operating in the world, watching the same shadow, holding the same line. Which brings us to the real question, not just what Gandalf kept from Galadriel, but what he was keeping from Sauron, using her. By sustaining Lothlorien with Nenya, quietly, without ever acknowledging to anyone that this was what she was doing, Galadriel was maintaining a fiction. The fiction that Lothlorien was simply extraordinarily beautiful and extraordinarily preserved by its own nature. No beacon of ring power advertised, no acknowledgement that one of the three was actively at work inside those borders. Just golden trees and clear water and the impossible sense of time moving differently inside than out. This was an act of protection aimed at Sauron, but it was only possible because Galadriel herself never behaved as though she knew the hunt was immediate and specific. If she had known and acted differently, the act itself might have drawn attention. The very effort of concealment, performed at scale, has a signature. A mind suddenly working harder to hide something that was previously hidden without effort looks different from a distance than a mind that simply does not know there is something to hide. Gandalf may have understood that Galadriel's most effective protection of Nenya was unconscious, or at least unacknowledged, that the cleanest version of her safety was the version in which she was not performing safety, but simply living it. And the only way to ensure she was living it rather than performing it was to not give her the specific information that would make performance necessary. By the time the Council of Elrond convenes in the Fellowship of the Ring, 60 years have passed since the quest of Erebor. The ring has been found. The crisis that Gandalf had been managing at arm's length for decades has arrived. And in that council chamber in Rivendell, Gandalf speaks. He tells the assembled company things he has never said aloud before. He tells Frodo's story from the beginning. He brings in Saruman's betrayal. He speaks of the ring with a specificity and directness that he had deliberately avoided for years. And Galadriel is not there. She receives news through Elrond, through the communications of the wise, through the networks that the elves maintained across the distances of Middle-earth. She knows what was decided. She knows that a fellowship will be formed. She knows that the ring will go to Mordor, but she was not in that room. And in a quiet way, this feels like the final expression of everything Gandalf had been managing since Dol Guldur. The most important council of the Third Age, the moment when the strategy he had been building for 60 years was finally being committed to, and Galadriel, who was perhaps his closest strategic peer, who was the most perceptive mind in Middle-earth, who had been pressing the White Council toward action for decades, was not present. She would receive the fellowship when they came to Lothlorien. She would look into each of them with her clear, devastating gaze, and understand what they were and what they would face. She would offer them what she could. Rest, supplies, the gifts she made for each of them in the Golden Hall. She would show Frodo the mirror, and let him see what was and what might be. And she would not try to take the ring, though the temptation came, and she refused it, because she had already decided, long before. In the same way she had decided everything important, alone, in the quiet, before the moment arrived, so that when it arrived, she was not choosing but simply acting on what she had already understood. This is the Galadriel who had been, for 60 years, working without the specific knowledge that Gandalf had carried out of Dol Guldur. This is the Galadriel who had sustained Lothlorien, held back the decay, maintained the watch on the border and the readiness of her people through decades of growing shadow, without knowing, specifically, that Sauron had completed his recovery of the Seven and turned his hunting eye toward the Three. She did all of it anyway, because she was Galadriel. Here is what this reveals about the nature of Middle-earth, that Tolkien was always gesturing toward, in the spaces between the battles and the maps and the genealogies. The world is not saved by the most powerful beings in it, not directly. not through the exercise of their greatest capacities. It is saved by the restraint of those beings, by their willingness to work through smaller agents, through ordinary courage, through the slow accumulation of choices made at the right moment, rather than the maximum application of force at every moment. Gandalf understood this in his bones. His mission was not to defeat Sauron himself. It was to ensure that the conditions for Sauron's defeat could arise, through beings and events that he tended with the careful, patient attention of someone who has accepted they are not the protagonist of their own story. Keeping silent with Galadriel was part of this. Not because she was less than him, not because he did not trust her, but because giving her the full weight of what he carried from Dol Guldur would have made her, for a time, a different kind of actor in the story. It would have shifted her center of gravity from the patient, sustaining work of Lothlorien, the work that kept hope alive for the peoples of Middle-earth across the decades of shadow, toward the acute, escalating work of crisis response. And the Third Age could not yet afford to lose that sustaining work. Not in the years after Dol Guldur, not before the ring had been found, before the fellowship had been formed, before the conditions for the war's actual resolution had been established. Galadriel held Lothlorien for centuries. She preserved it. She made it a refuge. She held back the decay with Nenya's quiet power. Year after year, season after season, keeping the trees golden and the water clear and the people ready. This was not a lesser contribution than fighting in the open. This was perhaps the greater one. And it was only possible because she was allowed to carry out that sustaining work without the weight of a specific knowledge that might have broken the long patience it required. Now the question returns, for the last time, heavier than it has ever been before. Did Gandalf stay silent about what he took from Dol Guldur because he believed Galadriel was strong enough to bear the knowledge, or because he knew she was, and feared what she would do with it? Both. The answer, as with the deepest questions in Tolkien's world, is both. He knew she was strong enough. He had never doubted that. He knew she was strong enough to bear almost anything. He also knew that bearing a thing and being unchanged by it are not the same, and that the particular knowledge he carried was the kind that changes the bearer, not by weakening them, but by shifting what they reach for. By making the acute feel more urgent than the sustaining, by pulling focus from the long work toward the immediate crisis. He protected her from that shift. He protected Middle-earth from what she might have done, not because she would have been wrong, but because the world needed her to do the other thing, the patient thing, the thing that looks, from the outside, like waiting, but is in fact the most difficult and necessary form of action. If you think about this long enough, it becomes unbearable in a specific way that Tolkien's work is very good at producing. The tragedy is not that Gandalf didn't trust her. The tragedy is that he did. He trusted her so completely, knew her so well, understood so precisely what she would do with the knowledge, that he chose to carry it alone. That is the loneliness of the wise. Not ignorance, not deception. The specific, deliberate, loving choice to bear something alone because you understand that the person you most want to share it with cannot be given it without cost. If you have been sitting with this, if this is the kind of lore that has kept you in the legendarium for years, the question I want to leave you with is simpler than it sounds. When do you think Galadriel figured it out? Because I do not believe she never did. I believe there was a moment, somewhere in those decades, when the shape of Gandalf's silence became clear to her, when she understood what he was carrying and why. And I believe she let him carry it. I believe she chose not to force the conversation, which means the silence was, in the end, something they shared. The legendarium is full of moments like this. Two beings who understood each other completely, choosing not to say the thing, because some forms of understanding are deeper than speech, and some forms of protection look, from the outside, exactly like distance. That is the world Tolkien built. Not a world of heroes and villains, but a world of the wise and the burden of seeing clearly in a place that mostly cannot. If this is the lore that keeps you coming back, drop the question you are sitting with in the comments. The gap that doesn't close. The scene that landed differently after you read the letters. The character who became someone else entirely when you found unfinished tales. This conversation never really ends. Subscribe and stay in it. There is always something further down.